Hello, BookTube. Just recently here in America, we had President's Day, a federal holiday that once upon a time celebrated George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and then broadened out to celebrate the fact that for well over 200 years in American history, the office of the American presidency and its ever increasing power was handed over peacefully from the previous holder to the incoming holder. A peaceful transfer of power, which existed in the United States until the year 2020. Uh, it is gone now. That precedent has been shattered, and like all shattered precedents, I don't think it will be coming back. But for a long, long time, it was possible to sit back on President's Day in the United States as a patriotic American and smile just a little. I didn't do that this President's Day, as I have for the last couple. I sat and brooded. But while I was brooding, I also thought about books. Presidential biographies are a fascinating subgenre of books. I imagine more fascinating if you're an American, but even so. Uh, and I thought that day, well, why not make a list? And I talked myself out of it, out of cynicism, out of depression, out of pessimism about what is coming in 2024. But the more I think about it, I know I'm late for President's Day, the more I think it might be a good idea. It might be interesting. Some of you might like it. I know I've had requests like this for a video like this before. So I thought we'd go over a President's Day reading list, a little bit delayed, a President's Day reading list where I will go through the list of presidents and give you a book to read. Strongly suggest a book to read. Now, in some cases, this will be just a look at that person's presidency. And in other cases, it will be a general, birth to death biography. It largely depends on the body of literature. Some American presidents have generated 100,000 times more literature than others. But we're going to go through them all. We're not going to skip anybody. So we'll start, of course, with George Washington. And for George Washington, most of the picks on this list will be fairly standard. They'll be fairly predictable. Any of you who know American history or who read American presidential biography will probably be able to guess a lot of these. These are my recommendations. And they are really good in the sense, that old advertising sense of if you only read one book, make it this one, that sort of thing. So for George Washington, I'm going to use James Thomas Flexner's book, The Indispensable Man. It's old. A lot of the biographies in here are old, but it does a really, really good job. Washington has inspired many multiple volume biographies. He has inspired many hot takes, and also many, many thematic studies. Patriarch, for instance, and also Cincinnatus. These are great thematic studies, but they won't really do as a birth to grave biography. So we'll stick with The Indispensable Man, and then John Adams. We will go with John Ferling. I know this will surprise a lot of you because you'll be synonymously thinking of a biography of John Adams with David McCullough. But Ferling is a lot more scholarly and every bit as readable. So we'll go with John Ferling for John Adams. Then for Thomas Jefferson, I want to choose Willard Stern Randall. Jefferson is another much chronicled American president, and a lot of those presidential biographies have an angle or an agenda, and Randall mainly does not. So I'm going to go with that. Then we do James Madison. Here I want to recommend Ralph Ketchum's book. It's very big, and it's a bit on the dry side, but nothing better than it has ever been done about Madison. So if you're you'd have to be in for a fair amount of parliamentarian obscurity to want to read about Madison anyway. So I figure you're already on board. Then for James Monroe, I want to pick Harry Ammon's book, Ammon. Again, when you're talking about Madison or Monroe, you're talking about a lot of in-the-weeds policy stuff. Some of these lives are different from others in that way. So Ammon's book will give you a really deep, complex picture. And keep in mind, when it comes to Jefferson or Adams or Monroe or Madison, in addition to skipping thematic studies in favor of something that leans more towards the biographical, on this list I'm also skipping writings by this president, whichever president. As time goes on, presidents were more and more inclined to write their own lives, to write autobiographies or memoirs. But even before then, and long since then, they also collected their own writings. They wrote on other subjects. Famously, Madison wrote quite a few fundamental documents. Monroe wrote quite a few fundamental documents to the United States. I'm leaving those out too. if you're interested in the figure, of course, you'll read them. But we're leaving those out of consideration. So, for instance, the next is John Quincy Adams, who wrote a journal his whole life that is amazingly good reading. And it's not unavailable anymore. It used to be, but Library of America now has a beautiful 2-volume set of the journal of John Quincy Adams. We're going to leave that out. We're going to leave out writings by the people. So for John Quincy Adams, I want to recommend Militant Spirit by Fred Kaplan. There was a little boom of John Quincy Adams biographies in recent years, and this is the best of the bunch. Then we'll move on to Andrew Jackson. Keeping in mind here that some presidents are more important than others, some presidents are simply more interesting than others, and also, occasionally, from time to time, a thoroughly evil man was elected to the highest office in the land. There's no way to avoid that. In fact, there are precious few ways. There's no way to avoid that. So Andrew Jackson, I want to pick H.W. Brands, historian I really like. He wrote a big, really readable biography of Jackson called His Life and Times. Then we'll move on to Martin Van Buren. Here there is really, in my opinion, only one historian. John Niven is really the only one to do here. He wrote a book called Martin Van Buren, The Romantic Age of American Politics. And it's as good as you're going to get on Van Buren. The problem with people after the founding father generation passes into retirement and then death is that for a long time the U.S. president was the chief clerk of the Senate. It was not that interesting or ground shaking an office, even when the person thought that it was. It still wasn't. It was still an extremely regional appointed position. It's only, you have to wait a century or more for the life of a U.S. president to necessarily be covering significant things. So with Martin Van Buren and a whole bunch of other people on this list, you're just going to have to deal with that. So The Romantic Age of American Politics by John Niven. Then for William Henry Harrison is an example of a president who I am going to include. It's a biographical study, but it's also thematic because there's no way to avoid it. Like I said, sometimes thoroughly evil people were elected president. And for William Henry Harrison, I want to choose a book called Mr. Jefferson's Hammer by Robert Owens. Like any other book that deals with Harrison responsibly in any way, it will deal with racism. William Henry Harrison was a racist before he was even a husband, a father, a human being. It was the sole defining characteristic of him. So a book that talks about, executive orders that he may have signed or upgrading the toiletry system in Ohio or whatever is missing the point. So I want to choose Mr. Jefferson's Hammer by Robert Owens. Then John Tyler will choose President Without a Party by Christopher Leahy. Quite a good book, very insightful on John Tyler, a president that no American knows anything about. There are quite a few of these upcoming presidents nobody knows anything about. Then James Polk. James Polk has, again, like John Niven, he has only one real serious biographer, one real serious historian as far as I'm concerned, and that's Charles Greer Sellers, Sellers. And here, I don't believe that Sellers wrote a 2-volume biography of James Polk. And as far as I know, he never abridged it. So, but it also flows. The end chapter of Volume 1 flows directly into the first chapter of Volume 2. So I think I'm within grounds as a stretch to think of them as one book. In this case, it's not all that much going to matter since I don't think anybody out there listening to me is going to want to read about James Polk. But it's Sellers' books. He wrote a 2-volume biography of Polk, and they are the thing to read if you're interested for some god unknown reason in this figure. Then Zachary Taylor. There was a book called Soldier, Planter, Statesman by K. Jack Bauer. It's sanctimonious and a little bloated, much like its subject, and it's also tedious, much like its subject. You're going to have to want it really bad to read a book about Zachary Taylor, but Bauer's book is the best one, if that's what you want to do, if that's how you want to spend your reading month. Then we'll move on to Millard Fillmore. Again, there is only one real serious person, I think. Robert Rayback, Rayback, wrote a book about Millard Fillmore. He did as much as he could with the subject matter. Then we have President Franklin Pierce, one of the most intelligent men ever to sit as president of the United States. Again, I'm not saying that makes him important. He's not an important president, and no one knows him. No one could possibly pick him out of a lineup as someone who had once been president of the United States. But there is a good presidential book about him by his college friend, Nathaniel Hawthorne. I'm going to recommend that. It's probably in the common domain. Uh, they'll move on to James Buchanan. And Robert Strauss wrote a book on James Buchanan just recently called Worst Period President Period Ever Period. This has often been true of Buchanan in presidential lists. He has often ranked number 1 or number 2 as the worst president ever, and Strauss challenges that, and he also challenges the metrics by which we rank the popularity of presidents. And in the process of that, does a really entertaining job of telling you all about James Buchanan. Of course, James Buchanan was not the worst president ever, and as much as it galls me to say so, neither was Richard Nixon. No president on this list ever even wildly considered orchestrating an armed insurrection to overthrow the government of the United States. No president on this list ever even dreamed of telling his armed followers to march on the Capitol and fight like hell. No president ever dreamed that. So when we're making lists of the worst presidents ever, Buchanan, Nixon, Andrew Johnson, they are far, far, far down the list. There's number 1 in gigantic veined Carrara marble. And then way down below there are people who are guilty of, at worst, little crimes and misdemeanors. Now, in retrospect and in comparison with number 1, the only president of the United States who ever planned and plotted meticulously and then orchestrated and incited an armed insurrection to overthrow the government of the country, execute his vice president, and install himself as an unelected dictator. That's so far beyond the pale that the title of Strauss's book, Worst Period President Period Ever, is already a little bit of a period curiosity. But you will find it very interesting. Then we'll move on to biggie. They don't get much bigger. The last president of the United States had said that he was better than this president and better than Washington. Still says it. It might have started off as a kind of, I guess, tongue-in-cheek joke by someone who doesn't tell jokes. But now it's said in complete earnest at every Klan rally. It said, the former president of the United States says, I'm better than Lincoln, I'm better than Washington. But we'll move on to Abraham Lincoln here, who was one of the biggies. And here, Lincoln is a perfect example of a U.S. president who has had a mountain of books written about him. So choosing is a little bit tough. The poet and novelist Carl Sandburg, for instance, wrote a trilogy of books about Lincoln that is beautiful. But I'm trying to stay away from multi-volume works here. I'm trying to go for just one book. So for this, we're going to go with Ronald White, who wrote a book called A. Lincoln, A. Lincoln, that is, for a one-volume biography of Lincoln, it will do the job. If you want a way in, if you're going to read just one book, you don't want to invest in a trilogy or anything like that, and with Lincoln especially, you don't want to deal with a micro-study. There are great books about Lincoln's relationship with the free press. There's a great book about Lincoln's period as president-elect, and those are written by the same guy, but they are micro studies. And you also don't want to deal with thematic studies with Lincoln. He's inspired thousands of them. So instead, we'll go with Ronald White as just a one-volume biography of Lincoln from birth to death. Then move on to Andrew Johnson. Here, Hans Trefousse, Trefoussse, wrote a book about Johnson. It's a litany of perfidy and weakness, but nevertheless, it's, in other words, very, very depressing reading. Some of the presidents on this list make far more depressing reading than others, and I don't know why you would want to do that. But if you do, that's what this list is for. Johnson features prominently in studies of the post-war South, of Reconstruction, of Washington corruption and whatnot. Surely you would get enough of him without going to a dedicated biography. But if you want one, that's the one that I would recommend. Obviously, I didn't get enough since I went and read all these things. Then we'll move on to Ulysses S. Grant. And here I want to pick a book by Gene Edward Smith that is really good, really dusts off Grant and presents him in the light of contemporary evidence rather than the sort of folklore about his presidency that has grown up over time. I found it eye-opening. And it's also tremendously readable. Just tremendously readable. And here, when we're talking about Grant, this is another prominent example of where I am not recommending books written by the president himself. I'm just not talking about it. It'd be a different video. It's the subject of a great book, but Grant famously has a memoir that's in the Library of America. There are 2 annotated editions in the last 10 years. It's widely considered one of the best, most ponderously statecrafty, Edward Gibbon-esque presidential memoirs ever written. I'm not 100% sure how much of it was written by Ulysses S. Grant, but there are photographs of him working diligently on it. But I'm not saying that I don't recommend it. I'm just leaving it out in favor of Gene Edward Smith's book, which is really, really good. Then we move on to Rutherford B. Hayes. And here, Harry Barnard wrote a book called Rutherford B. Hayes and His America, which is kind of what you have to do with make-weight presidents. You kind of have to do the age of, or so-and-so and his America, or so-and-so and the nature of American politics. You really have to do that. You can't, there isn't enough straw to make bricks with some of these people, and Barnard does a really good job of that. That kind of thing can be done really well, and he does. Then we move on to James Garfield. And here, there is a book that I want to strongly, strongly recommend. It is absolutely terrific. It's by C.W. Goodyear, and the problem is it doesn't come out until July, which is a problem you run into on this channel. There's an endemic risk on this channel. If you are absolutely on fire to read about President Garfield before July, in July there's a book that comes out on Garfield that is tremendously good, but if you're on fire to read about Garfield for some unknown reason before then, I would recommend Garfield of Ohio by John Taylor. Again, I'm not estimating here. I haven't researched whether or not any of these things are in print, but there's a wide and varied used book market out there on the internet. And there's also me. If I mention one of these books and you're absolutely dying to read it, I will certainly come across it at the Brattle faster than you will come across it at your used bookstore. So feel free, of course, to let me know. But that's James Garfield. Then we move on to Chester A. Arthur. Sort of the sweating piggy-faced definition of a make-weight president. And yet, Scott Greenberger made a great book out of Chester A. Arthur. It's called Chester A. Arthur, The Unexpected President. It's fairly recent. You'll be able to get the paperback in your bookstore. It is really, really good. I'm not 100% sure that it convinced me, but it was really, really good. So, and very spirited, exactly the way that you want. What you really want for a presidential biographer is that they go and do the research. Go to the family archives in Ohio, where all our presidents were born. Go to, the Library of Congress. Do the research, but then, as we say on this channel all the time, don't forget to tell a story. Don't forget to be good at writing. And Greenberger does, so you will really enjoy Chester A. Arthur, The Unexpected President, even though, if you don't know anything about Arthur, his story is going to feel more like a novel than real life. Then we move on to Grover Cleveland, and he was the subject of a biography just recently by Troy Senik called Man of Iron, that again tried to convince me that Grover Cleveland was truly great, and went a lot further towards convincing me of that than Senik did. Or rather that Scott Greenberger did. Senek's book on Grover Cleveland, Man of Iron, again, it will be in your bookstores. I don't think it's even out in paperback yet. I think it's that new. I reviewed it. I reviewed a lot of the books on this list, but it's fantastic. Just fantastic. Exactly what you want. Then we move on to Benjamin Harrison. And for this, I don't think anybody's going to want to read about Benjamin Harrison, but there is a book called Mr. President by Ray Boomhauer that, believe it or not, makes a lot out of Benjamin Harrison. It really does. It makes a lot out of him, about as much as can be done. And then in the list of presidents, we come to Grover Cleveland again, because up until now, at the present moment, when I'm making this video, Grover Cleveland is the only U.S. president who was elected to office, then elected out of office, then someone else went into the Oval Office or the White House, and then that person was voted out and Grover Cleveland was voted back in. Right now, as of this recording, Grover Cleveland is the only person to ever be president of the United States non-consecutively twice. But I want to stress that when Cleveland did it, both times he was elected. But anyway, we're going to skip because the Troy Senik book is your one-stop shop for Grover Cleveland. He doesn't get 2 books just because he got 2 bites at the apple. Then we'll move on to William McKinley. President McKinley was an interesting, a formidable figure, and also, I believe, a hinge point in the office of the presidency in a lot of ways. I thought this before. The book that I'm recommending is by Robert Merry. It is absolutely fantastic, one of the best biographies ever written of a U.S. president. And I thought that about McKinley before I got to. You're going to think it after you read that book, but I thought elements of it before I read that book. With McKinley, something changes. Even though the materials on the ground are largely the same, with McKinley, something changes. I think it might be, in part, although this is very romantic of me, something about the man himself. It was impossible to be around McKinley and think of him as the chief clerk of the Senate. It was impossible to be around McKinley and think of him as a minor potentate. He was a world leader. He would have laughed at that, but he was. And soon, the office of the presidency was going to catch up with that perception. but of course, Robert Merry's book is the one that I recommend, and of course, McKinley didn't live. He was assassinated. And that gave rise to Theodore Roosevelt, who was, again, a lot of people will say that the U.S. presidency, the hinge point of it changing, was Theodore Roosevelt. I think it was McKinley, but with Roosevelt, it's undeniable. With Roosevelt, it's suddenly undeniable that this is not Martin Van Buren. This is something very different. This is essentially a king. And Theodore Roosevelt, again, has had a million books written about him, but a lot of the really best ones have been multiple volume. We don't want to do that. He also wrote a lot himself. All of it's worth reading. But I'm going to recommend the book by Kathleen Dalton as a one-volume, cradle to grave biography of Theodore Roosevelt. Then we move on to William Howard Taft, the only president of the United States who was also Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, back when the Supreme Court was not a political body. And Taft is very important. He's a very important figure, I think. Everyone always talks about Theodore Roosevelt as a union-busting, trust-busting, oligopoly-busting president, someone who was against the entrenched interests and the malefactors of great wealth and whatnot. Taft actually enacted more of that legislation than Roosevelt did, and far more methodically, because good luck getting a kind of legal quibble past his mind. But he hasn't been the subject of a whole lot of any good biographies. There was a great 2-volume biography, but I'm staying away from 2-volume biographies. But the things that I'm talking about a lot on this list, especially these next 15 figures, they all have regular big 800-page popular history doorstoppers, going over their legacy, arguing about them, talking about them, making things clear about them, and Taft doesn't have that. But this is going to be one of the few times where I recommend something in there are often little series about U.S. presidents. They're 150-page soaking wet books that are meant to be sort of a little presidential library. Usually they are very little more than slightly overfed Wikipedia entries, and since Wikipedia is right there and is often very good, I usually don't recommend them at all. But Jeffrey Rosen wrote one on William Howard Taft for the American Presidents series, and it was really good. We've talked about this before. When you've got a series like that of sort of pre-formatted little biographies, no matter what it is, it's Penguin Lives or anything else, the author has a choice. Once they get their check, they have a choice. They can either do an overfed Wikipedia entry, which is very easy. In fact, they can get a subordinate to do it. Or instead of doing that, they give you a précis of the Wikipedia entry in the first 5 pages, and the rest of their book is their meditation on that figure, which can make the book unbelievably valuable, unbelievably interesting. Think about the Penguin Live series, for instance. Elizabeth Hardwick wrote a volume on Herman Melville that is exactly that, and it's more entertaining, more interesting than twice its weight in full-dress biographies of Melville. Same thing with Larry McMurtry did a volume like that, and Edmund White did a volume in that series like that. When an author does that, when they decide to think about their subject as opposed to just regurgitating the outline of the facts, the book can be valuable, and Rosen's book is. So I'm going to recommend that. It's very short. It's a fraction of the length of anything else on this list. Then from Taft, we move on to Woodrow Wilson, who is the subject of a longer work by A. Scott Berg, but I want to recommend an older work by August Heckscher, Heckscher, that is far more thorough, I think, than Berg's, and a lot less polemical. I'm not saying that that if a biographer goes into the subject with all sorts of ideological axes to grind, that rules out the book. It doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. Even when the axe to grind is hagiography, that still doesn't rule out the book. But uh, if you're only going to read one book, for that sort of thing, I want to sort of shy away from that as much as possible. That's for connoisseurs. I believe that someone who has read 3 or 4 biographies of Woodrow Wilson will look at will read Scott Berg's biography and come away. They might like it more than I do, but they'll come away with the same thing, the same basic reaction that I do, which is that despite its packaging, this really isn't for someone who's never read a Wilson biography before. So I'm going to go with Heckscher here. And then we move on to Warren Gamaliel Harding, who is weird. It's just a strange figure. And lots of weird satellite books have come up about President Harding. Lots of them. Lots of weird things have been written about President Harding. But I'm going to stick with a meat and potatoes thing that I think you will really enjoy. It's called Warren Harding and the Harding Era by Robert Murray. And it leans much more towards the kind of thing I talked about where the writer is not just talking about the man. You will get Harding's biography in here, but except for the parts that you won't get. there are a couple of parts to Harding's biography that no one will ever know. A very conscious effort was made in that direction. But you'll get, in this book, you'll get Harding's life, but you'll also get a broader look at his society, which can often be really interesting. So that is Warren Harding. Then we move on to Calvin Coolidge, who, much like Franklin Pierce, is one of the smartest people ever to be U.S. president, but also one of the strangest. I mean, Harding was strange in some ways, but they involved other people. Coolidge was strange all just by himself. He was a strange, strange individual, and shares with Chester A. Arthur, actually, but also William Howard Taft, possibly shares only those two men the distinction of someone who, not as a campaign comment, not as a joke among friends, but in genuine earnestness, may not have actually wanted to be president. May not have actually wanted that. You'll have to judge for yourself, but here with Calvin Coolidge, there's no choice in the matter. It's Amity Schlae's book, Schlaes. Amity Schlae's book on Coolidge beats everything else by or about the man, just all hollow. Then we move on to Herbert Hoover, a much vilified figure, Herbert Hoover, who ushered in the Great Depression. That isn't true, of course. Forces beyond his control were working, and a couple of recent biographies of Herbert Hoover, the mayor of Shantytown, as Charlie calls him in The West Wing, or refers to someone from the Hoover era as the mayor of Shantytown. It's common comic shorthand to say that Hoover, presidents are often unjustly yoked with the tragedies that happened during their presidencies. Of course, they are often justly yoked with that. Oftentimes, they react poorly. Oftentimes, they miscall the whole thing. And then it's perfectly just to associate them with the catastrophe that happens under their watch. But in Hoover's case, I think a couple of recent biographies of him will convince you that he did everything he could think to do to fix things. It's just in hindsight we can see that he was doing mostly all the wrong things, which, hindsight is hindsight, but given his financial background and his executive planning background, he probably should have known that. It's fascinating. Either way, it's fascinating. And for Hoover, there are a few good examples, but I want to recommend Herbert Hoover in the White House by Charles Rappleye, Rappleye, which I think, again, I reviewed. I'm pretty sure that I reviewed a lot of these books. I try not to let a major U.S. U.S. presidential biography go by. So Herbert Hoover in the White House. There are others. There have been, I think, 2 major new Herbert biographies in the last 10 years. They're both worth your time, but I think this one gets out for readability. Then after Hoover, of course, came another big U.S. president, like Lincoln, like Washington, another huge figure, and that's Franklin Roosevelt, who not only led the country during World War II, and a lot of the shape of that is the result of Franklin Roosevelt, not advisors, not Harry Stimson or anything like that, but Roosevelt himself, but also stayed president for a long, long time, 4 terms. That's amazing. And again, at the time of this recording, that was unprecedented and has not happened since. And Roosevelt also has an enormous amount of stuff written about him. In this case, I want to recommend Robert Dallack's book as a one-volume book that does not presume that you have read a library of Roosevelt books, and that captures the man and his essence. So Robert Dallack's book, I'm sure it's in your bookstore in paperback, probably with a very sexy blurb. So that I'm going to recommend that. Then Roosevelt eventually died in office. It was clear from even his second term to anybody who was watching that he was going to die in office, that there was never going to be a time when he conceded the presidency. And he did die in office, and his vice president, Harry Truman, took over. And Harry Truman has had a lot written about him. I myself don't believe that anything needs to be written about Harry Truman other than one line. He incinerated 2 cities full of women and children. That's it. That's all you have to say. Don't have to say that he was president. Don't have to talk about his folksy humor. Don't have to talk about anything like that at all. When we're talking about presidents who get the blame for the thing that happens on their watch, well, the buck stops here. It doesn't get any more blame than when you issue the order to drop thermonuclear bombs on 2 cities, knowing perfectly well what will happen to the people in those cities. But nevertheless, even though that's only one line, I'm going to recommend a long book, one of the longest books on this list, and that is, of course, Harry Truman, Truman by David McCullough, who you knew was going to make this list. David McCullough is a very entertaining writer, and I don't believe he ever got any better than his book on Truman. It's a doorstop. It's gigantic. Like some of the books on this list, it's a big undertaking, but it's really, really good. You'll keep reading. Then, after Truman came Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower presents a huge temptation to biographers because he led an active part of his life and then he led an inactive part of his life. But the inactive part of his life is when he was president. The active part is when he was winning World War II on the battlefield. Carlo d'Este, of course, I have to have a d'Este on the list here. Carlo d'Este wrote a book called, I think it's called Eisenhower, A Soldier's Life. So you can guess from that what it stresses. It stresses the active part of his life when he was leading the armed effort on the continent, when he was fighting against the Nazis. There have been other books. The Eisenhower Era is another really good one. There have been other books about his presidency, and I don't believe that a truly great nuts and bolts history of his presidency has yet been written, which is great. It's one of the great things about presidential biography is that there's always so much more work to do. But if you're more interested in his times and his presidency, you might want to go elsewhere than d'Este's book. But if you want to know the man himself, I would stick with this one. Then we move on from Eisenhower to John F. Kennedy, who's had a million books written about him, mainly about why he died, how he died. He was an assassinated president, and there are a million theories about that. Also about his time in office and the mythology that has accrued around it, the mythology of Camelot, a young, vigorous, a young, vigorous president and whatnot. And so there's an enormous body of literature to hew through. I would argue that Kennedy is, we've mentioned on this list gigantically important presidents who are absolutely pivotal in one way or another. I would say that McKinley is one of those who doesn't get the credit for it. People like Washington or Lincoln, or FDR. But I would say that John F. Kennedy is another one of those presidents, probably a lot like McKinley in that he doesn't get the credit he deserves for how momentous a president he was, which is, 10 days. He saved the world from thermonuclear annihilation, from a full-scale thermonuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, which would have rendered all life on the surface of the Earth extinct. Even then. Even back during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the full payloads of both those countries unleashed, which would have happened. It would have been a chain reaction that would have been completely autonomous. Even then, those payloads would have devastated the planet. And I know there are plenty of people who say otherwise, Gore Vidal first among them, Christopher Hitchens second among them, but it's my opinion, and I think the history bears it out, that he's the man responsible for stopping that from happening. He navigated that crisis in a way that his predecessor and his successor would not have been able to do. Which is really all that you can judge a president by. You can't judge them by the wisdom of the ages. You can just say, what about the previous guy and the next guy? Would they have done any better? You can't go further afield than that. But for Kennedy, I'm going to narrow it down to Michael O'Brien's book, a big one-volume biography of Kennedy that is really good, skirts away from the micro-studies, skirts away from the conspiracy theories, it just gives you the life of the man. Then we'll move on to Lyndon Johnson. And here, a lot has been written about Johnson, and most of it by one person, Robert Caro. Robert Caro was working on a multi-volume life of Lyndon Johnson. Unfortunately, he's going to die before he finishes that life. But In this particular instance, just this one instance, I want to recommend the greatest thing that's ever written about Johnson is not about his presidency of the United States. It's about his presidency of the U.S. Senate. It's called Master of the Senate. It's by Robert Caro, and it's a big honking thing, but it is brilliant. And I wanted to recommend that over a full life of Johnson. You get Caro's long-winded, so you get a lot about his background, and you get a lot about his upcoming presidency. Not as much as you would like, but this is the only book on the list where I'm not going to talk really about the presidency. I myself have not read a totally satisfying account of Johnson's presidency. Even Dalek, Robert Dalek, who's already been on this list and who I recommend, even his book, this note is going to be cropping up the further we come to the present day. But I'm going to recommend Master of the Senate, even though it's not actually about his time as president. Then Richard Nixon, where with Richard Nixon, your humble guide here enters into the historical record, since I was reading every newspaper about Nixon and was right on the edge of being able to write for publication about presidents. And of course, for a long, long time, a certain generation, probably for most of you listening, it would be your grandparents' generation, considered Nixon to be just hands down the worst president ever, the greatest betrayer of the trust of the U.S. presidency. He knew that people thought that. He resigned. And everyone at the time just assumed that. That is just the assumption that we're making. We've seen everything, we've read everything, we know what happened, and on this one subject, we can all agree this was the worst president ever. I said that for decades. It never crossed Nixon's mind, not in his most drunken stupor, not in his greatest persecution complex anger. It never crossed his mind to organize an armed insurrection to overthrow the government of the United States. That never crossed his mind. So again, gigantic marble one, and then all the others way down below for minor crimes and misdemeanors. And Nixon is a fraught subject. It's hard to find a really dispassionate biography of him that does him and his presidency justice. And the one that I'm going to recommend is an approximation of that. I don't believe that book has been written. That note is going to sound over and over again. I don't believe that book has been written. I believe it will be written by someone, when it finally is written, it'll be written by someone for whom Nixon is a figure in distant history. It'll be written by someone who's in high school right now. But Richard Reeves wrote a book called Richard Nixon, I think, Alone in the White House or something like that, that comes kind of close. You want to read it with a grain of salt. You want to read it with your guard up. And I tried to leave off this list any books that you need to read with your guard up. But when it comes to Nixon, it's unavoidable. So far, it's unavoidable. Then we move on from Richard Nixon to Gerald Ford. And here I'm going to commit a Steve sin once again and talk about a book that isn't out yet, although it's much closer to being out than it's A Very Ordinary Man. And it's by Richard Norton Smith, who also wrote a great book on Washington. It's a thematic study of Washington, so I didn't really include it. But his book on Gerald Ford is amazing. It's amazingly good. People have been waiting for it for a long time, and it was worth the wait. It's a serious study of Ford, who is a historically significant figure in a whole bunch of ways. America's only unelected president at the time of this recording. And also nefarious ways. Like I said, a president has to be responsible for what they do on their watch, sometimes unfairly. But if it's their conscious decision and we've got it in writing, then it's totally fair to blame them for it. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon rather than have him stand trial. He pardoned him. In the 21st century, where we are all so balkanized and tribalized that I know of people who would kill a relative if the relative disagreed with them politically. In the 21st century, people will now routinely say that he should have pardoned Nixon and Nixon didn't do anything wrong. But he's a tough figure to assess. In addition to being pivotal, and in addition to being unique at the time of this recording, he was also singularly dull. So Smith does a great job with that. So I'm going to say, rather than go out and get this book, I'm going to say pre-order it. Wait and pre-order it. If you're really interested in Gerald Ford, this is the book to read. Then we get to President Jimmy Carter, who at the time of this recording is still alive, but in hospice care. He probably will not live out the week. And that's sad. That's a sad thing. No matter what you thought about Carter, no matter what dirt you can dig up on what decisions of his you like or don't like, he was an honorable man. A decent, honorable man in the White House. And because of that, because of that fact, and because I freely admit it, I'm in the moment. The history is actually happening now. This will be the week probably where President Carter dies. Since I'm in the moment and since I'm a living human being, I am going to recommend a book on Carter by an affectionate subordinate, which I'm trying to avoid on this list because they're inherently untrustworthy. No matter how trustworthy the man is, the book will be inherently untrustworthy. I figure we owe it to President Carter at this point, right at this historical moment. You might disagree with that. Kindly don't disagree with that in the comments section. Kindly keep your disagreement to yourself. I know that common decency is out the window in the 21st century, and the very first thing that anybody does when someone famous dies, the very first thing that person does, that otherwise decent person does, is to hop onto their favorite social media and say good. I know that's the time that we live in. Kindly don't do that in my comment section, but I'm going to recommend a book by an affectionate subordinate for Carter. It's still a really, really good book. I reviewed it. It's by Stuart Eisenstadt, and it's called President Carter, I think, The White House Years, or In the White House, something like that. It's a big, fat book. And Eisenstadt, I shouldn't say that it's, I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt, but how many Kennedy books written by affectionate subordinates have I read multiple times and loved? Plenty. It doesn't at all make the book worthless. Eisenstadt's Carter book is really, really good. So I'm not just tossing in a sentimental sop to recommend it. Then we'll move on to The Blurry Present. Freely admit that. We'll move on to Ronald Reagan. Here, of course, I'm going to recommend Lou Cannon. Lou Cannon wrote 2 volumes on Ronald Reagan, but the volume I'm talking about is The Role of a Lifetime, which is Reagan as president. It's very much in the moment. It's very much governed by ruling passions, by present active passions. It's not the Reagan book that your kids will have available. Maybe Reagan books, that would be great. I don't believe that Reagan book exists, but this is really, really good. It's very much alive in its current sentiments, and will probably make some assumptions about your knowledge of Reagan and the events of the moment that don't hold up anymore, that might need a footnote, but it's really good reading. So, and after Reagan, we fall off a cliff, right? Because after Reagan, we're talking about writers who knew these figures, writers who were in the White House press pool, writers who took a increasingly balkanized and tribalized political stance on these figures one way or another. We stopped thinking of them as, oh, the president, started thinking my guy or the other guy's guy. Or in the parlance of 2023, a good guy or a literal supernatural demon. When you're approaching that kind of mind frame, the kind of presidential biography, the read one if you read none at all, presidential biography that I'm trying to list here becomes almost impossible to find. Becomes almost impossible to find that. And that's what we have going on here. We have George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. There hasn't been the kind of presidential biography that I'm talking about this figure. So I'm going to recommend something that I've kept this person off the list because he writes treacle. He writes books for Joe Scarborough of Morning Joe. He writes books for that kind of person. I'm just a simple country lawyer. These United States and Congress assemble. All that kind of empty tub thumping. We all know, American performatism that I just can't stand. I just can't stand it, and it produces more than its share a Mississippi River of treacle and pap. And the author I'm talking about is John Meacham. He's a smart guy. His books have gristle to them. They have a little bit of meat to them. He wrote a book about George H.W. Bush called Destiny and Power. If that title doesn't tell you what you need to know, I don't know what more would. He went to Kennebunkport and interviewed former President Bush, and at length, and former President Bush got all teary and weepy and sentimental because he, in his public utterances, was exactly that kind of Morning Joe, tub-thumping, fake patriotism. You don't do your readers any favor by looking at a figure like George H.W. Bush and reducing him to that. George H.W. Bush had his hands in a lot of very, very bad pies. He was no more innocent than anyone else who's ever walked the halls of Congress. And you won't get that in Meacham's book. But Meacham's book is very readable, and you will get a kind of portrait of the man. So I want to put a book in here as a complete stopgap This is a complete stopgap. The kind of history that I'm talking about, like O'Brien's history of President Kennedy, has not yet been written about George H.W. Bush. And then we have Bill Clinton. Talk about polarizing. It's even worse. We have, at least here, a great writer. Nigel Hamilton is a great writer on U.S. presidents. He's actually a great biographer just in general, whatever he turns his hand to. And he did a couple of books on Lincoln or on Clinton, and one of them was called An American Journey. It's about Clinton's years in the White House. It's still really hot in the sense of the biographer having his own lines that he won't cross, which you certainly won't get if you're reviewing, if you're researching President Garfield. There isn't going to be any bright lines that you yourself as a voter don't want to cross in your book, right? If you're rewriting a biography of some president that's a century dead, you're not going to have a tough time being dispassionate about Tippecanoe and Tyler too. You're not going to have a problem with that. But with Bill Clinton, even the greatest biographers trying their hardest to be dispassionate can't manage it. And Hamilton doesn't. He's tremendously readable. It's a tremendously fun book to read. But you just have to keep that in mind. That's all with Bill Clinton. That book has not been written yet. And if it's true for Clinton, how much more true is it for our next president, George W. Bush? Barely even the sketches of what we would need have been written. And with Bush and Clinton and George H.W. Bush, crucially, in addition to the fact that every biographer has been too partial and barely the sketches have been written, with those figures also equally crucially, a huge amount of the primary documentation has been destroyed. As the office of the president grew and grew and grew in power, it naturally started to accrue to itself some of the aspects of unelected autocracy. And one of those aspects, usually one of the first ones to appear, is the destruction of primary documents, a fear of the Hague. And that is true with George W. Bush. I have no idea how anyone will write that history, but someone will. So for George W. Bush, I have Dead Certain by Robert Draper. It's really good. It's very Knives Out. It's very sharp. It's not anything like these more recent ones are not anything like the earlier biographies that I'm talking about. You have to go into them knowing that. I would argue that with these presidents who are probably living figures to a lot of you, especially if the person himself is still alive, I would argue don't look for a definitive one-stop only biography yet. Keep your eye out and read everything. Because you live through this history, and if you're a reader of history and biography, that's kind of your obligation to know about this stuff, to read about this stuff. But there is no George W. Bush book along the lines of what I'm talking about, and that brings us to Barack Obama. Burton Kaufman wrote a book about Barack Obama. That there have been many books about Barack Obama, and he's another obvious example where I'm not talking about the things that the man himself wrote. But Burton Kaufman wrote a book about Obama that analyzes his presidency with as great a degree of objectivity as I think we can expect of anyone who was following the news and has been following the news since. So I'm going to wrap up the list there. I think it's an open and easily debatable question about whether or not Barack Obama's successor was elected with or without a vast amount of help from Russia. And also, it doesn't matter anyway because you're talking about a different era in American history. Barack Obama's successor organized an insurrection to overthrow the government rather than concede defeat and pass on power peacefully. He wanted to overthrow the government and change the nature of America from an elected democracy where if you lose, you leave, into something else. And so he doesn't belong on this list. There aren't any. The books that will be written on a completely different subject. They won't be about a president of the United States, and that's just going to continue. So I'm going to stop the list at Barack Obama, and there you go. That is a hideously long video here, but that is a list of books. I admit they get hazier the closer to the present day they get. I think that was unavoidable, but that still leaves you with a great deal of. You could build a presidential library out of these volumes. You'd be well on your way. Quite a few of the figures on this list, you could build a whole library on them alone. But this will do if you just want one volume on each of these people. So belated Happy President's Day. That's a nice long list for you to ponder. Thank you, BookTube.